Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of our video podcast, Between the Pillars for 2021. Thank you for joining us, and today we're turning the tables on our outreach librarian, John Shoesmith, and I will be interviewing him. Hello, John.
Hi, Liz. How you doing? You
I'm
should
good.
introduce
Happy New
yourself,
Year.
Liz.
I'm Special Collections Projects Librarian here at the Fisher Library, and you'll probably be seeing me again sometime on this podcast in the future. So.
Good. Yeah, it's going to be nice to do some co-hosting duties and sharing duties with Liz.
Yes. So, John, all this time you've been talking to other people, and so we thought it would be great for you to expand on some of the areas that you're very interested in at the Fisher.
We should also just explain, too, that as you can see, we're both remote. There is, I'm sure many of you are aware, in Ontario, there's another stay-at-home lockdown regulations that have been announced this week. So in the interest of health and safety for both of us and for the rest of the province and the city, we've decided to do this remotely. So it's going to be a little bit different in terms of how we're showing the material. Neither of us is at the library. Neither of us is going to be handling the material. But what we have done instead is capture some images of the material that I want to show today. So
neither of us are between any pillars today.
Sadly, no. We hope to return, though, in the next few months. We'll be back in the library.
Yes, definitely. So what are you going to be showing us today, John?
So today, I wanted to kind of revert to something, to one of my old chestnuts, which is basically the Canadian small fine press and artist books. And it's an area of interest of mine. It's been an area of interest of mine for a long time, particularly since I started working at the Fisher back in 2005. And it actually goes back even farther than that. It goes back to when I was a student at the I School, and which was then Faculty of Information Studies, and I was taking Richard Landon's class. Richard Landon, the former director of the Fisher Library, he taught the core rare books and manuscripts class as part of the I School curriculum. And Richard was great because basically there was only one assignment that he gave out.
Yes, I remember this. Yes.
I think you were probably in the last cohort.
His last class, yes.
And so basically the assignment was to create an exhibition. As many of you know who go into the Fisher, we have a very fantastic exhibition space. So the assignment that Richard gave out was to pick a topic that interests you and create an exhibition, obviously not physically create it, but intellectually create it, write an essay about it, write all the captions. And even though I was an archival student at the time, what really captured my interest was looking at handmade books, looking at books that had been produced by the literary community in Toronto, people that weren't very well known, marginalized people as well. So, and that kind of sparked my interest in looking and kind of studying a little bit more and researching more the small press. And the final essay I did for Richard, the final exhibition I did for Richard, was something I titled The Small Press in Canada. And then when I started working at the Fisher, I pitched this as a full exhibition for the Fisher to mount, and it got accepted by the exhibition committee. And so it really enabled me to look a little bit more deeper into what the Fisher's holdings were in terms of the small press and the fine press, and create this exhibition, which I did, which was mounted in, gosh, was it 2013, I think? I think it was 2013. So it was a few years ago now. And I had retitled it by then, A Death Greatly Exaggerated, Canada's Small and Fine Press. And I purposely chose A Death Greatly Exaggerated because at the time people were talking about sort of the death of the book, that e-readers were going to be taking over. And by looking at what the Canadian book community was doing in terms of having a very robust small and fine press community, you could see that the book was not going anywhere. And in fact, the book is thriving in so many ways. The material book is really thriving in so many ways. So I wanted to concentrate on really the last kind of the growth of book production, fine press book production, and small press book production beginning from the year 2000 and so. So it really did become an interest of mine, and it still continues to be one of my main research areas at the Fisher Library.
Wonderful. So I think you've chosen a few things to show us today.
A few things, and so let me go to share content. I think we can see that.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So as I said, unfortunately, we can't handle the materials today. We can only show images of it. But I've tried to give a sense of some of the diverse small and fine press holdings we have at the Fisher. And this is something actually Liz would know pretty well. I should mention Liz, this is also an area that Liz herself looks at, particularly because she ends up cataloging so many of these books.
Yes, it's a pleasure.
Yes, and this is one of the items that she cataloged. It came to us, I think it was about 6 years or so ago. It was a purchase, and as you can see, this is not the original binding, but what it is, let me go to the next slide. It is a book of poetry by Lucy Maud Montgomery. So we don't actually have an exact publication date on this. When Liz cataloged it, she gave it the dates between like 1903 and 1905. But essentially, this is such an important, interesting book. This is Lucy Maud Montgomery's very first publication. And one of the reasons I wanted to show this is that I kind of dubbed this something along the lines of, you got to start somewhere. And for so many writers, they don't end up publishing with big publishers right from the very start. A lot of their initial efforts are done very modestly, very in these small press runs. And this is something, for example, that Lucy Maud Montgomery published several years before she published the book she's most well known for, Anne of Green Gables. So this is a collection of somewhere around the lines of, I think it's around 30 poems in total. Many of them had already been published in different publications, but this is not very well. This book is not in any of the Lucy Maud Montgomery bibliographies, for example. So there's probably not a very large print run. I think there's maybe you know, Liz, better than I do, maybe 2 or 3 copies that we know of.
I think there were at the time when this was cataloged. There may have been more that surfaced.
As you can see, it's a presentation copy since it is signed by Lucy Maud Montgomery. So we don't know who this book was presented to. So what we may gather from something like this is that surely this book did not have a very large print run. It is self-published, and in many ways, this is the route that so many writers, particularly writers that we know that are well known today, this is the route they originally have to go through. They have to self-publish their work in order to get into print. So, sort of a nice, great example of someone who's so well known for something else, but her first publication is such a modest effort. And I wanted to show you one more example of that. Some people might recognize this. I'm sure Liz recognizes this.
Yes, I definitely do.
We have about 5 copies of this particular book. This, for those that don't know, is Margaret Atwood's very first publication, called Double Persephone, published in 1961. So several years before she published her first collection of poetry with I believe it was House of Anansi, The Circle Game. So this was published, she was a student at University of Toronto. This was published in 1961. And it's got this sort of little charming lino block cover that she did herself. So there's at the time, she didn't, it wasn't Margaret Atwood, it's by M.E. Atwood. So basically, this is a collection of, I think it's about 8 or 9 poems, her first published poetry in book form. As you can see, 1961. And the story is that she typeset this herself, hand-set it herself with the help of a fellow poet, David Donnell, and created about 220 copies in total. And when I was doing additional research on this a few years ago, I actually sent a note to her and say, like, how did you sell this book? And essentially what she did was, it sort of sounds quaint now to think about this, is that she would go to bookshops in Toronto and basically offer to them on consignment. It's sold for around, I think, $1.25, and I don't know how many she sold in the end, because one of the copies we have at the Fisher that I've displayed in the past is a copy that she gave to Al Purdy in 1970. So obviously in 1970 she still had several copies left. Mm-hmm. She's also recently said she wishes she had more copies of this still hanging around, because a fine copy of this book, usually sold by an antiquarian book dealer, can run you up to about $3,000.
Wow.
So yes. So as I said, a very modest effort to start her literary career.
And a great example of self-publishing in all respects, from the lino cut to the typesetting.
Exactly. I mean, and a lot of these poets, a lot of these writers, this is something they had to do in order to get in print. Especially obviously this is pre-internet days, pre-blog days. So nobody's publishing. The only way you can publish a book is if you do everything yourself. And that gives, actually, it's a nice segue into the next item I want to show, which is this little charmer. And actually, one of the reasons I wanted to show this was that this was one of the books that really got me interested in when I was doing the research in Richard Landon's class, that got me interested in this topic. This is a literary journal called Dig, produced by a Toronto writer, Jennifer Lovegrove. She's since become a good acquaintance of mine over the years. And basically, the story is that when Jennifer graduated from York University, I think it was around 1996, 1997, she started to get interested in the Toronto literary scene. And at the time, the literary scene was producing a lot of these zines, a lot of these self-published works. And what Jennifer wanted to do was she wanted to create a journal, not just for herself to publish, but for others to publish. And so what she would do was she would create, she ended up doing 11 of these in total. She stopped publication in 2007. So it had a good run of about 10 years, and she did 11 journals in total. The great thing about these is that every individual copy of the journal is a totally individualistic effort. Everyone's got a different cover. She got into collage, so she did a lot of collage stuff, a lot of handmade paper as well. So the print run was unique in the fact that if you bought the publication, you would receive a totally unique object. The writing would be the same inside, but the covers would all be different. So she spent a lot of time on this, and I think in the end it just sort of exhausted her, which is why she stopped doing it. She'd love to start it again, I think, but she just, as she said to me, she just doesn't have the time or the energy anymore, particularly because she's working a lot of her own writing. She's now published a couple of poetry collections. She's published one novel as well. So just to get you a sense, these are some of the. So this was, as you can see, Dig number 8. This is edition 8. This on the left hand, this in the middle is another Dig 8. So a totally different cover. And I just wanted to give you an example. I grabbed these from her website, which is why the resolution isn't perfect.
Items like that are very interesting from a cataloging perspective too, because it's a challenge to know exactly what you have always, and to be able to record all of the variants that you might get in.
And what we always tell people that are making their own books is make sure you have a colophon. Make sure you have information about the book somewhere, usually on the very last page, because that gives catalogers like Liz a leg up in terms of being able to catalog it properly and for people to get access to it. So remember, if you're making books, if you're listening here and you're a bookmaker, please remember, include a colophon at the end. Would that be good advice?
Excellent advice.
Yes. So let's move from literary scene to illustrated works. And I wanted to choose this because this is one of my kind of favorite images from a book, and we've actually used this in the past on a bookmark when we're promoting our small and fine press fair. This is the work of George A. Walker. George A. Walker is a Toronto artist. He's a wood engraver. He's a bookmaker. He's an educator. He's a book editor. So he does a lot. He's a real Renaissance man in so many ways. He teaches at OCAD here in Toronto, teaches printmaking. And this is from this book, which is The Mysterious Death of Tom Thomson. So basically what George Walker's been doing over the last several years is create what he calls wordless narratives. And wordless narratives do have a history going back to into the early part of the 20th century. Particularly with a number of different artists. Different artists would do these books that didn't contain any words. Basically, all they were illustrative texts to tell a story. And so this is something that George has been doing now for a number of years. He's primarily choosing Canadian topics. So this example here, Mysterious Death of Tom Thomson. I wanted to choose this particular image because this basically shows the tools that he had, the tools to create his wood engravings. And it's funny, Liz, I was thinking about this morning. The first illustrative technique for books was wood engravings, with illustrative works being done on wood. And you would think, 500-600 years down the road, we would have sort of not use this technique anymore because we're in the 21st century. But in fact, wood engraving hasn't gone anywhere. And in fact, it's a technique that is really it's really vivid and it's really striking, particularly for the kind of books that George is doing.
Yes, it's extremely appealing, and so a lot of people are attracted to learning how to do it and to material. Yeah.
They are, and they're fascinating. There's fascinating books, and so basically George has been focusing primarily with these wordless narratives on Canadian topics. So Tom Thompson being one, he's done one on Pierre Elliott Trudeau, very popular one he did on Leonard Cohen. His most recent work is on the Canadian silent film actress Mary Pickford from the 1920s. So again, trying to choose Canadian topics. As I said, they're really, really striking. They're really fantastic to hold as well. But George, in terms of these limited edition works, does everything himself. He binds the books, does the printmaking. So all of his
He did a great lecture at the library in 2017 that you can hear on our website about some of the processes involved in creating these works.
And the other great thing too is that we are getting the wood. George is now donating his wood blocks to us, which is really helpful for those who are studying this technique for one. So I just grabbed a couple of more screenshots from the book of Tom Thompson. And the great thing about George's books is that even though he does these limited editions, which can cost you, upwards of I think the Tom Thompson one is somewhere around $2,500, because they're very limited and they're unique objects.
Mm-hmm.
Porcupine's Quill, which is out in, I think it's in Erin, Ontario, run by Tim Inkster, they do a trade edition. So even though if you can't afford the original George Walker edition, the limited edition, you can still get the reprint that Porcupine's Quill does. And they do, and Liz can attest to this well, they do really beautiful reproductions.
Beautiful work.
And at a fairly minimal cost. This book, I looked it up last night, and it cost $22 to buy a work by George Walker.
And it's more portable if you want to take it camping with you.
Exactly. To get inspired, bringing your Tom Thompson book up to Algonquin.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move to another illustrative work that I really love. This is by Shanty Bay Press. So Shanty Bay Press is a press that is, nicely enough, in Shanty Bay, Ontario, which is somewhere maybe about 10-15 minutes north of Barrie. I visited their studio. So the Shanty Bay Press is run and operated by a couple, Janice Butler and Walter Baczynski, who interestingly enough did I think when we had a summer seminar series a few years ago, they did a session for us, and essentially Janice has a background in painting. Walter has a background in artwork as well and printmaking at University of Guelph. And so they've combined their efforts to create these limited edition, really beautiful books, these beautiful fine press books. They focus in on a lot of poetry. They focus in on classical subjects. They did a beautiful version of Virgil's Metamorphoses. And the technique, let's go back to this one. As you can see, it's a beautiful illustrative technique. This is poussoir. For those that don't know what poussoir is, it's essentially stenciling. It's a stenciling technique. So he individually does all the illustrations via stencil in these books, which is why they're so. Each one can be a little bit different because obviously if he's stenciling each copy of the book, each copy is going to be there's going to be a slight variant in all of them. So that's what makes these books really wonderful and unique. So this is a book called Circus. So what they did is they took 6 poems, I think, on the theme of circus, and Walter did these really wonderful illustrations attached to them. This is one of my favorite because this is a poem by Gwendolyn McEwen, who's probably my favorite Canadian poet.
Very striking illustration.
They really are. And unfortunately, the images here don't really do it justice because this is a fairly large book. This is pretty much a folio.
Yes.
So you don't get the sense of the size and scope. So hopefully,
and the colors are even more vivid in person.
They really are. This surrogate does not capture how magnificent these books really are. So hopefully, when we reopen in 2021, people come and take a look at these books themselves. And this is when I spent a day with them. I think it was 2017. I spent a nice summer day with them because I was writing an article for them for the journal DA, and so this is their workshop area. They're such a lovely couple too. So, and they do magnificent books. I'll go to the last one I want to show. This is always sort of one of the pride and joys that I always show when I do classes on fine press or small press. This is a book produced by a couple out in Mission, BC, Jan and Crispin Elstead, who have a press named Barbarian Press. Barbarian Press goes back to 1977, which they started in England, and then moved. They're both literature students, PhD students in literature in England. Were interested in getting into making books, so they started modestly in England, moved back to Mission, BC, back in I think around 1979, 1980, and started to accumulate a number of different presses. They built their own workshop out on their property in Mission, and I think they have something like 9 or 10 working presses, and they don't create many books over the years. They create maybe 1 or 2 books a year, and often they take a long time to produce. So this is in many ways their masterwork, and I had a whole display case when I did that exhibition on this one book. It's Shakespeare's The Play of Pericles, and they always take the approach they say they don't take the approach of maybe traditional bookmakers. They always take the approach of how is the best way to read a book, because that's coming from a literature background. That's really their main concern, is readability. Mm-hmm. And with something like Shakespeare, what they wanted to do was show the theatrical, dramatic aspect of reading a book. So basically, reading this book is almost like attending a production of the play of Pericles. And Crispin, who is apparently he acted and directed a couple of versions of Pericles back in the day, always takes that kind of theatrical interest in something like this. So as you can see, the book is this is the main spread from the book. That is really kind of striking when you see when you see it. To me, this is almost the perfect marriage of text and illustration. So the illustrations are again wood engravings done by Simon Brett, and there's over 100 of these in the book as a whole. So you've got some of these larger ones, you've got shorter ones, smaller ones that are peppered throughout the book as well, and it's just such a beautiful, beautiful book. This book was also 10 years in the making. So the original conception they came up with was in the year 2000. And the book was finally produced in 2010, 2011.
Just looking at the layout of the text and illustration on the page, I mean, you could tell that a lot of thought went into it.
And that's a nice segue, Liz. So this is basically a couple of images those are a couple of images of how it's bound, how that's sort of the product you get. This is the deluxe edition that we have at the Fisher. So I wanted to focus in again on, wanted to give a little closer look at the illustration itself on that page, but I wanted to go to this next page to show you, we're very fortunate that we have Barbarian Press's archives. And the great thing about it is that you can really map how a book like this is produced, particularly a book that was 10 years in the making. And a lot of it was because Simon Brett works in England, the Barbarians work out in BC. So much of their work was done via mail and then email. And so we get the entire production notes into the making of this book. So as you can see, we have this, and this is it's almost like storyboarding. If you think of traditional storyboarding when it comes to making films, they were storyboarding everything when it came to the production of this book. So again, they really, these are world-class people doing world-class books. And as I said, seeing the images on this PowerPoint slide does not kind of convey how wonderful and beautiful these books really are.
How does having the archive as well as the finished product help you with your work?
Well, I think it helps. It particularly helps with when we're teaching bookmaking technique. I mean, there's a robust scholarship now, particularly at University of Toronto, in the history of the book, in history of print culture. And so for to understand this, because this is almost a throwback. The work that they do is almost a throwback to way books were first produced back in the early days of bookmaking. They don't use computers, for example. Everything is done by hand, and so you get to see the development of how a book not only was made today, but you can get an idea, a sense of how books were first produced 500 years ago at the same time. So it's and also it shows the care and the attention and really the diligent hard work that is needed to put something like this together, to put production like this together. So I just want to give it sort of my final slide here is just to talk about, we've only scratched the surface of kind of our small and fine press holdings within this PowerPoint presentation. We have so much, whether it's zines, whether it's artist books, whether it's just all kinds of stuff that we have. I mean, here's some further examples: Aliquando Press, Church Street Press, Nelson Ball, Heavenly Monkey, which is one of our favorites as well. One of our
favorites, yes.
That we like to show. So it's such a rich and robust collection that we're always adding to as well. Whether it's by donation or whether we are going to the fairs and purchasing a lot of this material. So let me come back up on screen for any sort of final thoughts that we might have.
Yeah, I was just wondering, since at the end you were talking about how we get these materials in our collection, if you could talk a bit about your role in collection development for small and fine press material.
Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate that we're already starting from a pretty strong base of materials, but what we're always trying to do is, we can't collect everything, as you well know. It's impossible to be, as I said, to collect everything. So in the end, what we kind of do is we try to get what we call a representative sampling of various bookmakers. If it's someone like Heavenly Monkey or Barbarian Press, we try to purchase all of their books, or Shanty Bay, because we have some of the archives. We need to have all the books to go along with it. So we do purchase the complete runs of their books. But in terms of some of the smaller bookmakers, some of the zine makers, we try to do representative sampling as much as possible. We're trying to focus primarily on Canada. We have obviously examples from the US and from England, but we have limited budgets, and we can't purchase everything, as you well know. Because I know sometimes if we come back from a small press fair and we dump it on your desk, it's like, uh-oh, I got to do all this cataloging.
I also get very excited, but yes.
Yes. And you're instrumental as well in terms of collecting in this area as well. So it's I think we work well as a team. The other thing I always talk about is you can't necessarily tackle it from exclusively a personal aesthetic thing. You can't say, I don't like this book, so we shouldn't have it in the collection. So it may not appeal to my personal aesthetics, but it may actually be important to have as well in the collection. So you kind of have to guard against sometimes judging by your own personal standards and personal aesthetics in terms of when you're purchasing some of this materials, because we need to collect as much as we can, and I may not like everything we collect. You certainly probably don't like everything we buy in this area.
Definitely not, but it's important that we have it.
But it's very important that we have a lot of this stuff. So it's a challenge because Toronto has, I mean, not now because we're in COVID times, but we have a fairly robust community in terms of small press literary fairs that are going on, and you feel bad you can't buy everything, but you try your best to get, as I say, a representative sampling from a lot of these individuals.
Well, thanks for showing us all of that material today, John.
You're welcome. I feel a little bad that we can't show it in person. We can't we can't handle it ourselves, but as I said, we will be reopening hopefully in the next maybe 5-6 months. And then I encourage everybody to come and look at this material, because it's, as I said, these digital surrogates are only representative of how wonderful and special a lot of this material is.
Would you like to say anything about the next edition of Between the Pillars?
Yeah, well, we're still working on this season because of our challenging COVID times. But we will have a very, very special guest appearance in February, the Canadian author Lawrence Hill. is going to be joining us. We don't have the exact date on it yet. Watch our website for that. But Larry is going to be talking about writers and their archives, since we have his extensive collection of archival materials. So that's going to be an evening broadcast. More to come on that.
Great. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today. And thanks again, John.
Thanks, Liz.
Bye.
Bye.